serious?
Hi there guys, welcome to the Dutch Machine Channel. Thank you very much for tuning in for the fourth video in my build series of this Rotorama Buddy 7-inch quadcopter. And in this video we're gonna add a receiver. Now in previous build projects I've used Eversky receivers, I've used FlySky receivers, isn't it? Maybe, yeah, okay, so in this video I'm gonna use a Crossfire receiver, TBS Crossfire receiver. Yeah, and I'll show you how I install this receiver here. Brand new receiver, and the objective of this video is to show you that this is not difficult. Maybe you're contemplating getting yourself a Crossfire set up and maybe you're worried that it's complicated to install. It isn't, as I'll show you. And well, maybe if you simply don't know where to start, I'll show you where to start. In fact, well, you order yourself a receiver and you need a soldering iron. Yeah, so you do need to be able to solder. Sorry about that. And you need some soldering tin, obviously. Let me see. Yeah, you need a working flight controller in the term that it provides 5 volts for your receiver. And, not unimportantly, you need a diagram of your electronics. Of this, the receiver, and of your flight controller. Mandatory. And I am using a diatone / Mamba stack in this quadcopter. And well, they work, but also Diatone provides nice schematics of their electronics. And about that, if you haven't built a lot of quadcopters, it's handy to download and keep those diagrams. Maybe you want to work on your quadcopter in a year or even 2 years, and by then your stack might be, well, will probably be replaced with a newer one, and you might have a hard time finding the diagrams then. So download them now. Yeah. Okay, let's see what's in this bag from TBS. Okay, there's the receiver with a antenna already installed, as you can tell. They're a Mortal T antenna, small little receiver, and oh, this is different cable set. All right, we've got some shrink tube, more than enough for that receiver, as you can hopefully see, more than enough. We got a bunch of cables. And you can pick and choose the colors of your liking. Obviously you'll use red for power and black for ground, and well, we've got a white and a yellow cable. And we got a pin header. Yeah, in case you want to use a pin header, we won't, but it's nice that they provide that. Now let's actually have a look at that diagram for the stack I'm using. As you can tell, Mamba stack, that's from Diatone. And well, you actually don't even really need a schematic of the receiver, as Diatone includes it. As you can tell, and on the left of the diagram you see 2 receiver options. They've drawn in 2 receiver options. You don't need both, right? Hopefully that's clear. You select which receiver type you have. And in our case, TBS Crossfire Nano, and that will use 4 wires. 4 wires. Yeah, if you are completely new to this, basically that means that 1 wire is for the signal going from the receiver to your flight controller, telling your flight controller what you want your quadcopter to do, your channel inputs, your stick inputs. Then the second wire, the yellow wire in this case, will be sending information back from your flight controller to your receiver, and your receiver will then send that information back to your radio. That is called telemetry. So that your radio, for instance, knows your flight battery voltage, for instance, or GPS information, or speed, or distance, whatever. Yeah, okay, and obviously 2 other wires, a black and a red one, for power and ground. That's obvious. Hopefully your receiver will need power to operate. So again, 4 strands, and Diatone drew that onto the flight controller on RX and TX1. And that means that we'll be using UART1, COM port 1 on our flight controller to communicate with our receiver. And we can choose another one. We pick, for instance, on the other side of the flight controller, what is that? TX3, RX3, so UART3, that's definitely possible, but there's no real reason. Maybe you have a reason. In my case, I'll be using UART1 as seen in this schematic. So again, very useful and handy to have the schematics handy, and I'll even leave that on screen while soldering up. And there's our real flight controller and receiver, and it looks exactly the same, right? We've got 4 solder pads over here. Well, we've got a lot more actually, but we'll be using 4 solder pads on the receiver. And for the receiver install on our flight controller, we'll also be using 4 pads. And that'll be these 4 pads over here. And it's a one-to-one thing, right? There's not even a crossing between the cables. Diatone really made this easy. Over here we got the ground, which will correspond to this ground. We've got a 5 volt over here, which corresponds to this 5 volt out on the flight controller. Then we've got a TX1, basically. TBS calls it differently, but in our case that'll be its job of this pad. TX1 will go to this pad over here, and this last pad on the receiver will go to the pad closest to these buttons on our receiver. This one over here. And I'll actually be soldering up the wires to the bottom of my flight controller. In a minute I'll show you why, and you can definitely, if that's easier for you, solder them up at the top. But as mentioned, I'll show you in a couple of minutes why I'll solder up the wires to the bottom of my flight controller. Okay, so first thing we'll do is pre-tin all tabs, so the 4 pads on our receiver and the 4 pads on our flight controller. Alright, there will definitely be some cases of me having my hands in the way, but I hope I can at least tell you what the hell I'm doing. Yeah, so again, a simple job of pre-tinning the tabs. Again, you will need to be able to solder, and these are reasonably small tabs, so this is probably not something you want to do as your first soldering job. Alright, so you heat the actual pad, and then you try to lay down a bead of solder, having the soldering iron at 390 degrees Celsius. Hartstikke. Hopefully you can see that. We've got 4 solder blobs on our receiver. Now we'll need to do the same for our flight controller. Again, I'll be soldering up the wires to the bottom of my flight controller, and as you can tell, these Diatone flight controllers have all at least most. Yeah, probably all the solder pads you can find at the top of the flight controller you can also find at the bottom, for your convenience. Tell me in the comment section below if you can guess why I'm using the bottom pads for this. If you've built quadcopters, you will probably know. Alright, we also have 4 solder blobs on our flight controller. Now, the next thing we'll do is solder up wires, the 4 wires to our receiver. So that'll be, let me see, which will I be doing first? Yeah, the bottom one. Okay. No real reason, but I know it'll be easiest to reach this way. I'll be using a yellow strand, as you can tell, for my telemetry. No real reason for that. I actually would have preferred a green one. Yellow I usually reserve for video on my quadcopters, but this is definitely usable. And okay, so now the camera is really in the way of things. Let's see if I can pull this off. So far so good. Okay, so I'll use the white strand for my signal. So this will be the wire that'll carry my stick inputs to the flight controller. And yeah, my hands are now definitely in the way. Sorry about that. Yeah, okay. We got 2 wires, then we got 2 left. We need 5 volts. 5 volts. By the way, these wires that come with the receiver, the TBS receiver, are already pre-tinned. If you are using wires that have not been pre-tinned, tin them first, obviously. Okay, last one, ground. Okay, now give all these wires a little bit of a tug to see if they're physically well connected. Don't pull on them hard, by the way, but give them a little tug to see if they are well connected. Okie dokie, so that's step 1, I guess. The next thing we want to see is how long we want these wires to actually be. You don't want a lot of excess in your quadcopter, right? Wires that dangle around, so put your flight controller back in your quadcopter, see where your receiver will fit in your frame, and then check out how long these wires will need to be. Alrighty, there's our frame again with the flight controller temporarily in place, and I'll be placing my receiver up here, and that's at the front. There's lots of room for a receiver, especially for a small little receiver. And okay, so the antenna cable is pretty long, and the antenna will actually be placed over here in the nose of my quadcopter. So I will probably wrap that antenna cable around like so, more or less, so-ish. So I won't have that antenna cable dangling around. That's the idea. Will that work actually? Should work. Yeah, so that'll have me end up with the wires of the receiver actually end up at the front over here. So I will probably not have that much of an excess of the cable. Well, a little bit. Hopefully you can see that I will have a little bit of excess. So I will snip off a little bit of those cables, right? And well, that's the cable I'll be using. Alrighty, so I've already stripped off the ends of these wires, about 2 millimeters. And I'm gonna pre-tin these, right? The pads of the flight controller have already been pre-tinned. Now it's time to pre-tin the ends of this wire here, so let's get to it. Alright, again I've got my soldering iron set to 390 degrees Celsius. And what I'm gonna do is I'll support the actual wire with my soldering iron and then press the tin onto the wire from the top. You don't need an enormous blob of solder on these wires, by the way. You already have a solder puddle on the pads of your flight controller, and that'll be most of what you'll need. Chickadee, okay. We've got that sorted. Now, one thing of note, you might want to now put a shrink tube around the wires. You might not be able to once you've soldered up the wires to the flight controller. So maybe check that if the way you'll be curling up the wires you will be able or won't be able to put that heat shrink on the wires now or afterwards. Hartstikke idee. So there are our 4 strands. And yeah, okay, so this will look a little bit different on my flight controller than on the diagram, because I've got the flight controller upside down, right? This is the bottom of the flight controller, and this is the top. This is the left side of the flight controller, and again we'll be using the 4 pads from the buttons over here, the white thing on the right. So these 4 solder pads we'll be using, but at the bottom. So let's see, the first one will be ground, and I'll be using a little plier. Again, this will be a lot easier for you, not having a camera and lights in the way. Okay, so I'm gonna set that wire onto the pad and put my soldering iron on top of it, and it'll take, well, no time at all, and your wire will be stuck. Okay, so the furthest out one was the ground. Second one from the top for me, that is power, 5 volt in this case. Chickadee. Solder blob should look nice and shiny, silvery. Okay, so and the white one, remember, look back the video if you don't remember, but the white one is our signal cable, and that'll be the one we want now. So the signal cable is the one next to the power cable. Chickadee. And again, I'll show you in a second why I'm soldering my wires to the bottom of our flight controller. And the last one, the one closest to that button, that white thing, is telemetry, and we use the yellow wire for that. Hi, Chickadee. Okay. Again, tug on those wires a little bit to see if they're securely in place. And you have already noticed that I'm curling up the wires to keep them together, but it'll also prevent interference. But mostly it'll keep your wires together. And let's see, this here is the no, this is the rear. Okay, so I'll route my wires alongside this coil, this grayish coil, so that my wires won't get squashed. This would probably be a nice time to put your anti-vibration grommets on your flight controller. In my case, I will be adding the Vista set afterwards, so I can wait until then, but yeah, this is probably a good time to add those grommets. So the next thing we want to do is, well, check if there's no magic smoke, and the Crossfire receiver should instantly go into bind mode. This is a brand new receiver, right? If it's not a brand new receiver, you might need to press a bind button, but in this case it should again go straight into bind mode. So let's see. Okay, that looks fine, and then I have a look at our... Alrighty, here we have a Crossfire transmitter, and let's get into the menu, TBS Agent Light, and Micro TX, and bind. Enter to execute. Let's see if anything... No, you can't see the receiver, but something has definitely happened. And we update the firmware on the receiver. Okay, this will take a while, right? I'll speed up the video. Alright, almost done, 95%. things are going to plan and you can't see the screen anymore. Okay. Is loading, don't interrupt, in progress. The LED on the receiver is now flickering. It's probably rebooting, binding in progress, and binding in progress. Binding okay. And the LED on the receiver is now solid green. Thank you very much. That was painless. Yeah, so again, that should be the procedure again when you have a brand new receiver. And let's have a look at the beta flight configuration to make the receiver actually talk to our flight controller. Alright, we are in a beta flight configurator, as you can tell. And we're gonna hook up our quadcopter. I don't have a LiPo connected to the quadcopter yet. But, okay, warning, standard warning. I haven't fully configured the quadcopter yet, and we'll close that for now. Actually, let me calibrate accelerometer. Okay, not really part of this video, but I want to get rid of that warning. So, if you remember, and if you've paid attention, you know that we've hooked up this receiver to UART1. The UART1 or the TX and RX1 was located at the left side of our flight controller. So let's have a look at the ports tab here. And okay, this is a bit of a coincidence maybe, but my serial RX, which is the receiver, is already on UART1. And that's what you want. And that's everything we need to do in this screen for the receiver, that is. And if you've changed anything here, you need to hit save and reboot. We haven't changed anything. So we move on to configuration. And I think I've already set that up, but the only thing we need to do here is check if the receiver type is serial based over here, and then select Crossfire as our receiver type. And I already have Crossfire selected, as you can tell. And you also want to check telemetry or switch telemetry on. This is a telemetry receiver, right? And we'll also be, in my case, using telemetry for our Vista setup, the DJI setup. So you want telemetry on. Oh, and I'll also want, I'll set the dynamic filter on later on. Okay, so if you've changed anything, then you again have to hit save and reboot. And then switch on your transmitter and we'll check if this works. So I'll hook up a battery. Cheeky day. And then we'll move to the receiver tab. And you can probably already tell that things work. We have actual inputs, which is great, right? And this, it won't get any harder if all is well. You don't have to set a serial RX inverted or anything else. Maybe you're used to that with FrSky receivers. In my case, I have a fresh install of the firmware on my flight controller. If not, then you might want to change things. Let's actually check. Get serial RX. Hotchkiday. So serial RX provider is CRSF, Crossfire. Serial RX inverted is off. Serial RX half duplex is also off. Just in case you've got settings left over from a different receiver, right? Check those three things. Again, Crossfire as your serial RX provider. And serial RX inverted off, serial RX half duplex off. And that's it. Set your ports correctly and set your receiver type correctly and you should be good to go. So guys, that is basically it. That's the installation of a Crossfire receiver. Yeah, I'll zip tie it down and that's it. Right? Oh, and I almost forgot to tell you why I routed these wires or soldered these wires onto the bottom of my flight controller. Well, you can probably now see it. There's no wires running over the flight controller. And it's not a horrible thing to have your wires running over the flight controller, but at the top of your quadcopter you'll have your battery strip, right? And while strapping down your battery, you'll move that strap around, potentially tugging on those wires had they been on top of my flight controller. And that's simply a potential hazard, something that can go wrong, something that can, be undone, a solder joint being ripped off. And there's no reason for it, as you can tell. My solder pads are now well protected. Well protected. You can always damage things if you want to, but this is reasonably safe like this. Again, your battery strap or things other than that won't hit those solder joints. And that's it. That's why the wires will also be ever so slightly shorter, but that's not the real reason. Okay, I hope that makes sense to you. For now, I want to thank you for watching. I hope this was informative. If you are left with questions, don't hesitate to ask. And in the next video, we'll be installing the Vista set, so the DJI digital setup for this build. Hold on for that. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.